After reporting earnings, AMD is down by over 10%. Right now, it's selling below 110 at the time of me making this video. Today, we're going to take a brief look at AMD's balance sheet and estimate what the stock price of AMD could be by 2030. And is this stock worth buying or something we should skip? But before we get started, please hit that like, follow, and subscribe button. First off, it's revenue. It's up by almost 24% from last year. Last year in Q4, it was 6.2 billion to today being 7.7 billion. Its GAAP and non-GAAP margins are also up. Last year's GAAP margin was 47 to today being 51. Last year's non-GAAP margin was 51, today being 54. However, you do start seeing slight concerns when you get to operating income. Is up on a GAAP basis and also on a non-GAAP basis, meaning it's spending more money to make more money. That is a bit concerning, but when I take a look at it from a long-term perspective, not so much if it doesn't continuously have to spend this money to keep its customers. Earnings per share on a GAAP basis is down and on a non-GAAP basis is up. So this means on a non-GAAP basis for the future is positioned to return a better value to us as a shareholder, but as of right now, it is not achieving those metrics from last year's Q4 to this year's Q4. Another thing I really liked that its profit margin is going up. It was 47 a year ago, for today being 51. That is an indication of strong products and services and the likelihood that customers will continue to pay more prices for them to continue using their products and services. And the last metric I feel like is very important to highlight, it is data center revenue. It's up by 69% from last year, but its operating margin is still the same. So it spent the same amount of money while increasing its data center revenue by almost 2x. I don't want to bore you with the rest of the metrics, they're pretty boring, but these are the main metrics that solidify this company is in good position and in strong health for us to invest in for the long term. Now, let's do the estimation and see what the stock price could be by year 2030. These are AMD's current metrics. For us to get a price target for 2030, we need to estimate and hypothesize what these metrics will be by 2030 for us to get a stock price. Let's start our analysis with the revenue. Its revenue for the last 12 months is almost $25 billion, which is an increase of almost 10%. If we go take a look at its 5-year revenue, in December of 2022, it hit $23 billion in revenue. It only now, this most recent quarter, surpassed that amount by $1 billion, meaning in September of 2024, it now hit 24 billion, which is extremely concerning for me. But we do have some positive news. Its data center revenue is exploding. It's up by almost 90% quarter after quarter, meaning every quarter it makes an additional 3 to 4 billion from the previous quarter. So there is a positive catalyst for its revenue to reaccelerate. Now that we have a general theory of its revenue hypothesis, let's take a look and see what ChatGPT thinks its revenue could be by 2030. So as you can see, analysts are projecting a $40 billion in revenue by 2026. Now, if this trend continues and in its later years revenue even shrinks to 15%, it could still demand almost 74 billion in revenue. Now, let's see what Gemini thinks. Gemini says 80 billion. I think that's a bit too high, so let's ask DeepSeek. Shares the same sentiment as ChatGPT with 72 billion in revenue by 2030. So I'm gonna go with 72 billion, which is almost 200% growth in revenue. Next metric, we're gonna take a look at its number of outstanding shares. Now, it has never ever done stock buyback. It's constantly diluting the shareholders by a tremendous amount. Now, when it was diluting the shareholders massively by almost 30% in this area right here, it had an explosion in growth. I am talking 4 to 5 times revenue growth in this time period. So its dilution underpaced its revenue growth, meaning even though it diluted it, it reutilized that capital effectively enough. Once it hit a ceiling on its revenue, it pretty much stopped diluting the shareholders, only doing about 3% one quarter in 2023 and then less than 2% for the remaining 3 quarters. In my personal opinion, this company is not done diluting the shareholders, but I think it's going to be a little bit more cautious doing it. So I'm expecting about a 2% dilution, which is nothing. Next metric is its margin of profit. Now, its margin of profit has been 8%, and that's because it's trying to aggressively compete with Nvidia. Once it has a pretty good market share where it can realistically compete with Nvidia, I think this profit margin will go up to 20%. And the last metric we need, it is PE. historically its PE has been in the hundreds, and that's because again it was massively growing, so it demanded a higher multiple and it got it. But in the future, I don't see that thing repeating itself. So I'm going to say its PE is going to be 30, while its profit margin will be 20. Once we enter all these metrics in, we get a price of $260. Meaning, if you were to invest that same money into the S&P 500, you would get $163, which means you are getting a 2.4x return. If AMD is able to hit these metrics, it can easily demand above 260 in its stock price. Now, in my personal opinion, with this pullback, it is a company worth taking a risk on. But here's the thing, right? If you have a choice to buy a Nvidia product versus an AMD product, currently you are choosing Nvidia. The only reason that you are buying AMD is so that you're not overly reliant on Nvidia, or that they don't have the chips available to give it to you. And I don't like that scenario that AMD is in. As a long-term investor, I want to know that the products and services of a company that I'm investing in are in high demand and they're not a second fiddle to anyone. But I would take a small stake and see how this stock does in the next year or so. Even though my gains might not be as extravagant as if I was put all the money in today, the opposite side is if it can't hit these metrics, or that it starts to plummet really aggressively, Nvidia continues to dominate the market, I only lose a small fraction of my money. I think this approach is the best approach for AMD just because right now it is second fiddle. But I want to know what you guys think. Do you guys think this stock's worth investing in, skipping in? Are you buying? Are you selling? Comment below and let me know. And also, please hit that like and follow button.